Well, good evening. It's great here to be with you. And if you're a visitor here, as you've heard, I'm a visitor too, as well. So at least we have something in common, even as we start off together. As you may be able to detect, if you listen very, very carefully, I spent most of my childhood actually not living in this part of the world at all. And I'm not coming from the north of England. I spent most of my childhood growing up in the Middle East. And so, as I grew up, the context I was in, found out very little about the Christianity, the Christian faith, who Jesus was. I was in a small country called the United Arab Emirates in the 70s, and then Saudi Arabia in the 80s. And so I grew up actually really not knowing anything about the Christian faith. When my parents moved to a country called Cyprus, which is in the Mediterranean, sort of just about as far east in Europe as you can go before you leave Europe. That was the first time I had the opportunity to find anything out about the Christian faith at all. And I went along, and I didn't go along, so I got to know this guy, and I thought this guy's really interesting, and I persuaded him he should set up a youth group, because there wasn't a lot to do if you were an older teenager in Cyprus. It was pretty boring. I started driving when I was about 15, and I wasn't particularly rebellious. I never really got into trouble because I never got caught for anything. And everything that happened was never really my fault anyway. There was a time when I accidentally sank my parents' car in a river, but that wasn't my fault. There was another time when we also burnt down a disused cinema, but that wasn't really my fault either. Just every so often things would happen, but we ran out of stuff to do. And I found this guy, and I just liked him, and I said, we should get a lot of teenagers together, and we should just do something with teenagers. And eventually I persuaded this guy this would be a good idea. He wasn't initially very willing to do it, and I went along to this group and discovered it was going to be a Christian thing, because this guy happened to be a Christian, which I wasn't anticipating. But it was actually interesting, and I went along every week, and every week would talk about stuff, would ask questions, would debate about things, had a huge opportunity to ask all these different questions, and I just guess I started slowly learning, and one week I went along to this group, and I saw a little bit early, and I saw the guy who was looking, I could see he wasn't as bubbly, as excited as he normally was. I said, what's wrong? And he said, I've been trying to arrange to take you guys away for a weekend, and I just can't get permission from the government. It was a very tightly controlled government setup. So you needed permission actually from the central government, from a cabinet minister to actually go. And I said, that is no problem. We have connections. We are the government in this particular place. It's to say we had influence and we could make things happen. And I said, I'll take care of it. So I said, whose permission do you need? He said, well, the Minister for Interior needs to give us permission, and the Chief of Police needs to give us permission to take a youth group to go and use a government-controlled campsite. I said, I've got it. I went home, and I said to my mother, who is actually from that part of the world, Mum, do you know the Minister of Interior? And she said, yeah, I do. She grew up there. She said, when I was 15, he invited me, the guy who's now the the Chief of Police, So the guy who was the Chief of Police invited me to go out on a date with him when I was 15. He was 17. She said, your Uncle George came along, knocked out his 2 front teeth, and said if he ever spoke to me again, he would kill him. And I said, well, I need his permission to go away on a camp. And so, my mother rang the Chief of Police, and he immediately apologized. He said, I had no idea it was your son. If I knew your son was part of this, I never would have said no. Please forgive me, and I hope I never offended the family, because the kind of family connections we had, you wouldn't want to offend in any way, shape or form, if you know what I mean. And so he said, you have permission. And then my mother said, okay, the Chief of Police says yes. Who else do you need to help? I said, do you know the Minister for Interior? She said, of course. I said, well, I need his permission too. He was slightly harder to track down. He was on holiday in France. But as soon as he found out who was asking, he sent a fax. Some of you may be old enough to know what one of those is. Otherwise, you can use Google to discover later. But he sent a handwritten fax from his hotel in France to give his written permission to release the government website, also apologizing for any offense caused to the family. And then a couple of weeks later, we go off on this campsite. I set it up. I went up a day early with a few friends. We set up this camp. And then the next day, all of my friends arrived, and the day after that, I became a Christian at this camp. So God actually had me organize my own conversion, which isn't something that everybody can say. And ever since then, that was something which has so completely changed my life that I can genuinely say I've never really been the same since, and I mean that in a good way. But just before I became a Christian, I was very resistant to the idea, and the reason I was very resistant to becoming a Christian was very straightforward. My life seemed to be going very well. I felt happy, I felt fulfilled, things were promising, everything was going well, things weren't particularly difficult or challenging for me, everything just seemed to be good. And I think, I wouldn't have said it quite like this, but I think if you'd asked me, Michael, are you happy, before I was a Christian, out of 10, you know, where would you score yourself? I would have put myself somewhere between 8 to 9. You know, I mean, this life couldn't have been much better as far as I was concerned. And when I began to look more and more into the Christian faith, I began to get more and more worried, because as I looked into the Christian faith, I became increasingly concerned that it was true and real. And then one day when I was away on this camp, I became utterly convinced that it was so true and it was so real, I could no longer not believe it anymore. And that idea made me feel depressed. The fact that the Christian faith was true, it really bothered me. We were camping on the top of this huge mountain in the country called Mount Olympus, and I went up more or less near the top of it, and I chain smoked my way through 40 cigarettes, thinking, do I want to become a Christian tonight or not? And by the end of it, the fact that it was true, the fact that I come to the conclusion that it was real, meant that I felt like I can't not say no, I have to say yes to this, but I wasn't happy about it at all. And I came in, and when I found some of my non-Christian friends, you know, at that point I knew as a non-Christian I was going to become a Christian, and I got some of my friends together and I said, guys, I have some bad news for you. He said, I'm going to become a Christian tonight, I'm going to ask these guys to pray with me, and I'm telling you, because from now on I won't be enjoying my life anymore. And that's why I was really worried about becoming a Christian. It felt like there was going to be this massive existential downgrade in my life. Does that make sense? In other words, everything, so about having fun and just feeling joyous and full of things, I'll become a Christian and it would go like from here to here. I just didn't feel good about that at all. And so it was a struggle. And then it was a massive surprise after I became a Christian to find out that I didn't feel depressed about it at all. But I honestly believe that if the Christian faith was true, if the Christian faith was real, it would make my life worse than it was before. And this is one of the huge struggles that we very often have when we begin to start thinking about God. Because sometimes we wonder whether he actually loves us, whether he's actually interested in us, and we even ask ourselves whether he even has our interest at heart. In other words, would becoming in relationship with God, following him, actually make life more difficult, less fulfilling, worse? In other words, we're not doubting God's existence, we're doubting his goodness. And if you believe in God and you cease to think that he's good, either you try to ignore him or you even get angry with him. And what I'd like to do is share a few thoughts with you. This is going to confuse everyone who was here this morning, because I'm going to be speaking out of Jonah, chapter 1. I want to just read a few verses, and I'm going to tie this into one of the huge struggles we face in our culture today. So one of the old books of the Old Testament is this story of Jonah. And here's how it starts out. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to this great city of Nineveh, preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port, and after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from God. In other words, to run away from God. And the question is, that I'd like to put to you is, why do you think Jonah would want to run away from God? So whether you believe in God or not, if God came to you, spoke to you, actually, you had a conversation with him, what would the response be? Would you want to run to him or run away? Jonah runs away. And the reason he runs away is really quite simple. Jonah is absolutely certain that God is wrong. He doesn't want God to do what he wants to do. Now, let me just leave that there, and I want to now step into our modern day culture. Because a couple of years ago, I was reading an article that got me thinking about something in a whole new way I've never thought about before. I was reading it in the Times newspaper, so obviously it must be true if you read it in the Times. And it told the story of a student who was studying up in Scotland. And the student was being criticised in a debate with the union of students that she was part of for failing to respond to a letter that had been published against her, publicly attacking her. And in the debating chamber, the student raised her hand to make the point that she had decided not to respond publicly to the criticism of her, but she wanted to respond privately. So she'd written privately to the person who published the letter against her. Does that make sense? To say, can we meet and talk? So she raised her hand to say, look, it's not that I'm not saying anything. I'm trying to talk to them one-on-one. So then the whole debate was shut down, and there was a debate about whether the student who just raised her hand should be expelled from the debating chamber. The reason was that it was deemed she had violated the safe space policy of the National Union of Students according to the Scottish Constitution, which had deemed and banned all forms of hand gesture that denote disagreement. And clearly, if you disagree with someone, you're violating safe space, and that space becomes unsafe. And so by raising her hand, she violated safe space, because it was clear she was going to disagree with the person speaking against her, and thereby she shouldn't be allowed to be in the debating chamber at all. And I can remember sitting there thinking, wow, how on earth did we get there? A debating chamber is meant to be a place where people debate, and debate normally means two people who are saying two different things, not the same thing. Because true safe spaces aren't where everyone agrees with you. That's an echo chamber. A real safe space is a place where you know you're in a position with someone, and even if you disagree, they're still going to have your back. They're still going to respect you as a person, even if you come to different conclusions about things. Now, a little while after that, there was a series of events that you might have read about in the newspaper. Shortly after that, there was a lady called Germaine Greer, a very well-known feminist, who published gave an interview just before she was going to be giving a lecture at the University of Cardiff, in which she made various comments about transgender people. I'm not going to repeat what she said. It was offensive. She used lots of short four-letter words. It was not polite or nice. And as a result of making these comments, it was mooted that she should be no platform from the university for having made these comments. It wasn't safe to have her. And so she was written to and told that, initially she wasn't welcome. Well, after that, as soon as that became public knowledge, a guy called Peter Tatchell, who some of you will know is Britain's leading gay rights activist and has been campaigning for gay rights and gay marriage since the 1980s. Peter Tatchell had a press conference in which he said the Union of Students were wrong to try to no-platform Germaine Greer. They should allow her to come and speak. And then disagree with her afterwards, come up and say, no, I think what you're doing is wrong. And after he said this, a motion was then, he was written to and basically said, you are also not welcome to speak at British universities, and you are being no platform because you're making space unsafe by disagreeing with people. So at this point, especially when he was accused of transphobiaism, racism, and even possibly homophobia, which is utterly bizarre, another guy called Richard Dawkins, who you may have heard of, well-known professor at Oxford University, in a short press conference he held, he let it be known what he thought about the intellectual capacity of a group of students who could look at Peter Tatchell's life and come across and basically conclude that he was so phobic, he was so unsafe, he shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a British university. And he spoke up in defense of Peter Tatchell. And then after that, there was another motion that was debated within the NUS about having Richard Dawkins no platform to not speak at British universities, because clearly he was disagreeing with other people and therefore creating even more unsafe space. At this point, a guy called Brian Cox, I don't know if you've come across him at all, well-known professor, loves his music, sort of science meets, I was going to say jazz, but that's not right, more like science meets punk rock. He held a press conference in which he said, look, you can't ban Richard Dawkins from speaking at British universities. I mean, he's like a pretty well-known scientist and academic, globally recognized. You can't do that. And the question is, what on earth is going on? What has actually happened with all of us, where we're now finding ourselves struggling with this kind of stuff all the time? What is it that's changed? Now, in the past, when we used to talk about culture and analyze culture, we often used to contrast what we called honor cultures with what were called dignity-based cultures. Now, I was raised in a very classically honor culture. In an honor culture, the thing that you ultimately esteem or respect about someone is they conduct themselves with honor. And so if you want to be respected as a leader, if you want to be admired and looked up to, the key thing is that you conduct yourself with honor, you act honorably, you respond with honor. And if you're attacked publicly, you respond to defend your honor. Does that make sense? Which is why in old European culture, if someone came up with a glove and slapped you in the face, you would have pistols at dawn, bang. Okay? That was an honor fight. You've been publicly, your honor's been affronted, you have to defend your honor. So sometimes it worked out negatively, but in other ways it would work out positively too. It's what we look for in our leadership, it's what we esteem, it's what we value, it's what we praise. Now that's very different to a dignity-based culture. In a dignity-based culture, the argument's very different. In an honor-based culture, you earn respect by the way you conduct yourself. But in the dignity culture, the argument's slightly different. It goes like this: look, you should respect me because of who I am. I don't need to earn your respect by acting with honor. Every human being has dignity. And what we value in our leadership from other people is that they act with dignity. And they respond with dignity. So if someone comes and disagrees with you, you may not respond publicly. You may say nothing publicly. You may take the whole debate offline and sit down with the person who's insulted you and attacked you and talk to them. And then having sorted it out with them, you may then come out in public and say, okay, everything's fine, we've sorted it out, let's all move on. And that would be a dignified response. Does that make sense? That would be responding with dignity. And we would value that. In a dignity-based culture, that kind of response would be valued, it would be esteemed. We would look up to it and say, wow, that's amazing. And actually, a lot of the Western world is a blend of those two cultures, honour and dignity somehow like blended together, and it's partly to do with the influence of the Bible on Western culture at large, that we look to those two things and we esteem them. But now we're increasingly talking about a different type of culture. We're wrestling with something in a totally different way. And it's more to do with how we conduct ourselves in what's increasingly now being referred to around the world as a victim culture. Now, the best way to think about this is in terms of how do we handle disagreement. In a victim culture, what happens is you think, look, because of all the terrible things that have happened to me, I have, whether it's in the present or whether it's in my history, I should have special status, and everything I do is motivated by love. But anything you do, if you dare disagree with me, is only explicable through hatred. So as soon as you disagree with my point of view, the answer is, well, you must hate me. And if you hate me, that must mean you must be phobic, whatever, against me. Which is why Peter Tatchell can be denounced in incredibly strong terms. Because the student who wanted to get Peter Tatchell not coming, was also wrestling with those very same issues and had those same questions. So Peter Tatchell disagrees with me, therefore he must hate me, therefore he must be phobic against me. And we reduce everything immediately into hatred all the time. We increasingly do it. We're struggling. When we start to think of ourselves as having special status as a victim, we begin to think that actually the rules that apply to everyone else definitely shouldn't apply to me. It's not fair. Now this gives me a huge advantage in many parts of the world. My mother, I told you, is actually from Cyprus. That country's been under foreign occupation for almost 3,000 years. But it's still divided. One half conquered by Turkey, other parts of it taken over by the British. And so, if you want to talk about, long-term victim culture, hey, this bad thing happened to my people 200 years ago, 500 years ago. Well, we've got 3,500 years of victim narrative. Which is why if you meet any really good people from that country, they play that card all the time. In a sense, because you can out-victimize everybody else. You think you've got a history of victimization. Well, what about us? Okay, we can beat everybody. And that is the problem. The problem becomes that all forms of disagreement, once you adopt a victim mentality, are automatically translated into hatred. And that's a problem. Because maybe there are times when people may disagree with what I'm saying, not because they hate me, but because they love me. Is it possible to know a kind of love in which even if someone were to disagree with you, you know it doesn't translate and equate into hatred? Is it possible to know something which is very different to that? Now, we're beginning to see this play out in our politics. It's being referred to as the vortex of grievance. You see, in a victim culture, the way it goes is, you're not allowed to speak about my problem. Does that make sense? My historical victimhood, unless you've had the same problem as me. So if you dare comment about my situation, then I'm either going to label you as racist, makes sense, because you're against my people, or I'm going to personalize it in terms of whatever my preferences are, and make it then very, very personal against me, or maybe I'll do both at the same time. Now, the trouble with that is things can start to get very, very, very complicated. What it means is, no one's allowed to speak about my situation unless they share my position. So what happens in a victim culture when it becomes dominant? Well, society divides itself into little victim groups. And no one's allowed to join my group unless you advocate my complaint more militantly and more vociferously than me. And if you advocate my complaint more vociferously or more militantly than me, well then I'll co-opt you in. You can now be part of my group. Up until the point you ever disagree with me over anything, and then I'll throw you out for hating me. That means if you're running for political office in a democracy today, what you simply do is you count up the number of victim groups that there are in your thing, you do the maths, and you start to advocate all of their complaints more militantly than them. And then you win. And we get locked in a cycle of competitive victimhood. Because now we have to argue about who's got the greater grievance. You come to me and say, well, look, Michael, I know what you've got. Okay, but this is what I've been through. And then you give me your complaint. You try to out-victimize me. So then I then come back with you. Well, look, okay, you've had that, and that, but I've had that, and this as well. Or where I grew up in the Middle East, in terms of our politics, the way it goes like this is, well, of course we hate you. Last week you did that. And I say, well, of course, we hate you. We did that because last month you did that. And they say, yes, well, last year, you did that. And then I say, yes, but last decade you did that. And then they say, yes, but last century you did that. And then I go, yes, but 500 years ago, this group, came over here and they did this. And does that make sense? It's like a competitive victimhood. You're locked in this vortex of grievance, which is always spiraling downwards. We're all trying to out-victimize each other. Any of this sound even remotely familiar? Which is why we now, if you want to have status in this world, you must have a victim narrative. I don't know if any of you, have anyone here seen the original Superman movie? 1980, whatever it was, 86 was it, Chris Reeves? Any of the younger people? Okay, there's some old people with their hands in the air. Anyway, so Superman, the original Superman, those of you who are old enough to remember, don't be ashamed. What were Superman's original weaknesses? Apart from kryptonite, okay, which was a physical, made him feel weak, what were his weaknesses? And the answer is, Superman didn't have any weaknesses. Morally, perfect. Physically, perfect. Rationally, perfect. Patient, kind. He reminds me of myself in so many ways. I mean, he was just perfect all the time. And that's what made him a superhero. He was perfect. Have any of you seen Man of Steel, the millennial remake of Superman? How does that movie start? Superman is on a boat in the middle of nowhere, lost in a big fog. And he feels cosmically lonely, cosmically abandoned, betrayed, left by his parents, cut off from his people, misunderstood, misrepresented, unable to cope with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Superman needs a victim narrative to be a superhero today. That's where he gets his status from. Wow. Have any of you seen any Marvel movies? Yeah. Okay? Go on, put up your hand if you like Marvel movies. Just put up your hand. Don't be ashamed if you watch them. Shame on you, that's rubbish. I mean, I only watch that kind of garbage because I do cultural analysis and research for talks like this. It's just a purely academic pursuit for me. But just think about every Marvel superhero. All of them have been abused, victimized, abandoned, hurt, betrayed. That's what makes them superheroes. They have a victim narrative. Even Captain America, the most boring superhero ever invented. Even he, in order to have a sequel, needs a victim narrative. What happens in the sequel? Well, he's lost his love, incapable of forming relationships, betrayed by his country, betrayed by his people, betrayed by his friends, misunderstood, misrepresented, deceived. He needs the victim narrative. All of us are competing to out-victimize each other. We're looking for it. It's what we actually look up to. But more importantly, it's beginning to govern our response. And we've totally lost the ability now to form deeper forms of relationships which can withstand forms of political disagreement or social disagreement or theological disagreement, whatever it may be. We wonder, is it actually possible to make friends, to make real connections with people who are different to us? Now, the amazing thing is, to have a victim culture, you actually need real victimization. That's the tragedy about it. When we esteem it and we elevate it up to the level it's at, then all of a sudden there may be times when people lie or exaggerate about pain they've been in the past in order to join the club. But generally speaking, you need something really that's gone wrong. You need some real injustice to hang everything on. Something which is historical and true. The difference is that in a victim mentality, we automatically assume that everything is always someone else's fault. It's never mine. So in an honor culture and in a dignity culture, the one thing you don't do is you don't go crying off to daddy every time something goes wrong, because that's not dignified. Does that make sense? That's not honorable. Almost every culture in the world, Chinese culture, Japanese culture, all Asian culture, Middle Eastern culture, African stories, long-term, old European stories, you read any of them, they will all have stories of the privileged young prince or the privileged young princess, does that make sense, who was spoiled, and always got their own way by complaining because they had power and manipulating people around them and made everything about them, and they're very, very narcissistic and everything revolves around them. And they go crying off to daddy to sort out all of their problems. But all of those stories either end in one of two ways. Either that person gets deposed and their brother or sister, to my sense, takes over from them and it's a good ending. Or you hope that they have some kind of moral transformation of their character. Make sense? They suddenly give up that feeling. And they actually become a better person. They abandon that sense. But the trouble is once you totally buy into the victim culture and it becomes a point of celebration, we make third-party appeals for help all the time. Everything is always someone else's fault. And we start to cry out and we say, well, if you don't do this for me, then clearly you hate me. An easy way to illustrate this is, I don't know if any of you have had the pain of having close friends or people close to you divorce. But if you ever experience a very bitter divorce, you'll notice something. One of the divorce parties will come to you and they'll tell you all the terrible things that have befallen them. Does that make sense? And what happens if you say to them, well, maybe some of this was your fault, just a little bit, just like 2%, what will happen to your friendship with them? Now feel free to go Pentecostal and yell at me at this point. What will happen? It's over. They're saying, what? How can you possibly even side even 1% with them? Does that make sense? They will tell you the story, and unless you hate them as much as they hate them, in other words, if you dare to, then clearly you're a hater too, so you hate them. And then, of course, the other person comes to you and tells you their side of the story, and it starts getting very confusing. Does that make sense? You listen to her, you think that she's married to the worst man who ever walked on the whole planet. You speak to him, and you feel like that somehow they found each other. And you're thinking, what happened? And there are some terrible cases, I mean some terrible one-sided cases, but normally there's a little bit from one side as well as just, it's not normally wholly from one side. There's normally a little bit that's also come from the other side too, but we're blind to it. And anyone who seeks to point it out to us, we hate. How dare you say that? My pain, my victimhood, the things that have been done wrong to me justify the way I feel about everybody else. And that's the really difficult thing about a hardline victim culture, is if you offend me, and you upset me, and you dare say I'm wrong about anything, I'm happy to do very terrible things to you, but here's the big difference. In an honor and dignity type culture, which is the kind of thing I say that the worldview that the Bible certainly does produce in spades, if you lose your temper with someone and you get really angry with them and you wake up the next day and you feel terrible, and you slap your forehead and you think, oh, I better go and apologize to them, and you hate apologizing to them because you know they were wrong. Does that make sense? What they did was wrong, what they said was wrong, the way they did it was wrong, but you lost your temper and you know that was wrong. So you need to go and apologize and say, I'm sorry I lost my temper, but why don't you want to apologize? Because you're thinking, and they're going to interpret that as, I'm completely right. And you know they're not right, and you can't apologize by saying, look, I'm really sorry I lost my temper, but you were really wrong in what you said, because that doesn't work. You may have noticed that. And you hate it. But in the victim culture, when someone offends you and upsets you, and you're angry with them, and you feel that your anger and your hatred is justified by all the pain you've been through, and you do something wrong yourself, when you wake up in the morning, you don't feel bad about it at all. You actually feel good about it. You say, you know what? They deserve that. They deserved even worse than that. And now, you can self-righteously justify all of your anger and your hatred, which is one of the hallmarks of victim cultures, is they're very self-righteous and they're very narcissistic. And we feel justified in hating other people. We feel good about it, because we are so morally right and they are so completely wrong, and we're so unable to entertain any idea of being wrong, we know that we're okay hating them. And believe it or not, this is the story of Jonah. Jonah possibly speaks more powerfully to our contemporary global culture than almost any other book in Scripture. Because Jonah lived at a time of huge injustice. Massive. I mean, utterly massive injustice. He lived during the time of the Assyrian Empire, and if you study ancient history, or some of you university students can go and do some reading when you go back, you will see that some historians will argue that the Assyrian Empire is the most evil empire that has ever existed, ever. And that's a big claim. Right? Worse, than the Nazi concentration camps, worse than some of the awful things that Stalin did in his country. I mean, just the most morally depraved, violent, evil culture that has ever walked on the face of the planet. So that's the time when Jonah exists. Jonah lived during that time, and this incredible, evil, oppressive empire that invented new forms of torture, new forms of killing, that was dominating the world and causing all kinds of suffering. And he's surrounded by it. His tiny little country is surrounded by this Assyrian Empire. And it's very interesting. God comes to Jonah and says, Jonah, I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh, one of the big capital cities of the Assyrian Empire. I want you to go to that place, and I want you to go and preach against it and say to them, preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. Now I want you to imagine, just for a moment, the person you hate the most. I'm not even going to give you the benefit of that, there's no one you don't like. I want you to imagine the person you detest the most. I'm hoping it's not me at this point. And then I want you to imagine this person that's hurt you, abused you, whatever it is. Imagine God came in front of you, looked at you in the eye and said, hey, you know that person? I want you to go and tell them from me that their wickedness is so amazing. The stench of it has literally risen up to heaven. And I am going to judge and punish them for it. Now, how would that make you feel? How would you feel if God came and vindicated your detesting of another person or group of people? I mean, come on, be honest. Wouldn't you sort of feel like, oh, I'm glad, God, you finally came around to my point of view. I've been suffering with this for ages. I thought you'd forgotten about me. I'm really glad to know you're on my side. This is great. But what does Jonah do? God comes to Jonah and says, Jonah, the people which are oppressing you, killing you, and imprisoning you, I want you to go and tell them that what they're doing is so evil, so wicked. The stench of it has literally risen like smoke to heaven. And I have smelt it, and I'm angry about it, and I'm going to judge them for it. I mean, come on, wouldn't you feel good? Wouldn't that be nice? I'm prepared to admit my weakness here. This would be very affirming. And what does Jonah do? Jonah runs away. He doesn't just run away. He's told to go this way, he goes that way. He goes in the opposite direction. He's told to go up to Nineveh. He goes down to the coast, to the seaside, which is obviously why I picked this message for here. And then, if you keep reading the book is very, very literal, because it says he goes down into the harbour, down into a boat, down into the bottom of the boat, and then he goes out into a big storm. And he gets thrown, and he goes down to the bottom of the sea, and he goes down all the way. It literally says to Sheol, to hell. He goes down as low as you can physically go. So he goes as far as he possibly can, and as deep as he possibly can, to get away from God. And the question is, why? Why would Jonah, having been given this incredible divine commission, Jonah, the people you can't stand, I can't stand them either, I'm commissioning you to go and tell them. And by the way, I'm backing it up with all the might of my judgment. You would expect Jonah to be running the other way, wouldn't you? Whoopie-doo. And then, if you know the story of Jonah, when he goes right down into the bottom of the thing, God sends a giant fish or something that swallows him and then spits him up onto a beach. And this is a part of the story that some modern readers feel is a little bit fishy. And all I can say is, I'm a father, I'm allowed to make these jokes. And after this very dramatic experience, he thinks, okay, God, I'll go and do what you want me to do. And he goes and he tells them, guys, you've got 40 days, and then God's going to come and judge you. And every man, woman, and child in that city repent. Every man, woman, and child in that city, they tear their clothes, which is a sign of having done something wrong, suffered some great loss, and they say, God, we are wrong. What we've been doing is wrong. The way we've been acting is wrong. What we've been saying is wrong. How we've been behaving is wrong. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. And they just, God, we're sorry. And God forgives them. They come to God and they say, God, we are sorry. And every man, woman, and child, 100% repent. They all turn back to God. And in verse 4, after Jonah witnesses the largest recorded spiritual revival in all of the entire Bible, Jonah sees this, and we read, but to Jonah this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. This is hard to translate this passage well. It's written in Hebrew, and the word to become angry, this seemed very wrong, he became angry. That word means Jonah was so upset, he felt physically, violently sick. I don't know if you've ever been so upset, so angry, you feel like you could throw up. I don't know if you've ever had that kind of intense, just anger. Jonah is so angry that God has forgiven these people, he feels like he could vomit. And he says to God, Isn't this what I said when I was still at home? That's why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I know you are a gracious and a compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life. It's better for me to die than to live. Jonah is angry with God because God has forgiven his enemies. Jonah is so angry. Now, I find this interesting because sometimes people say to me as a Christian, Michael, you have a huge problem as a Christian because, okay, the God of the New Testament is fairly nice, but the God of the Old Testament is horrible. Well, that problem, theological problem, can be overcome through the complex process known as reading. And all you need to do is read it. You will read about God's love and judgment in both. And what is Jonah's complaint about the God of the Old Testament? Jonah's problem with the God of the Old Testament is you're too gracious, you're too kind, and you're too compassionate. You like forgiving people, and I can't stand it, God. Jonah is angry with God because he has just witnessed what he feels is a massive failure of justice. How could God not intervene and destroy the people who is destroying his people? How could God not take his side and wipe them out? How could God do that? And so Jonah is massively angry with God for this massive, complete failure of justice. And God then says to Jonah, Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? And Jonah's so angry he doesn't even answer the question. And then a big plant grows over Jonah that God gives him a plant to shade his head from the sun, and then the plant dies and Jonah gets even more angry. So who knows, maybe he was bald as well. And God comes a second time and says, is it right for you to be angry? Even the plant died. And Jonah says, it is right. And I am so angry I could die. Jonah maintains his anger to God all the way to the end of this book. If you read the entire story of Jonah, it won't take you very long. It's very short. You'll see that we never hear anything more from Jonah. Those are Jonah's last words. Jonah's last words are, he points his finger in the face of God and says, I am right to be angry. And I wish I were dead. Now, what kind of story is this? If you think the Bible's full of happy morality tales and each one has a nice happy ending to the end of it, you're going to be a little bit disappointed because it's much more true to life than that. Jonah is angry with God's failure of justice, and he can't believe he's just forgiven his enemies. But here's the thing that never occurs to Jonah. The thing that never occurs to Jonah is that the same loving kindness that God has extended towards the Assyrians and allowed them to be forgiven for all the terrible things that they have done is the same loving kindness that God is extending to Jonah to forgive Jonah for all the terrible things he has done. And there's something very humbling when you can overcome your self-righteous anger and pain and say, wow, God, maybe you have something to say to me. Maybe my heart isn't right here. Maybe I'm not as innocent as I like to think. And it's incredibly humbling. I mean, it's massively humbling. And it changes the way you think about people who do things to you. You know, we're so intent in hanging on to bitterness. I remember speaking at a university. Actually, a lady who was at that university came and spoke to me before the service. It's not her, in case you're wondering. But I remember speaking at the university here in the UK several years ago, and every day, every night, this lady came to hear the talk. And she was on the front row every night. There's 5 nights in a row that I was speaking, and every night she came and sat in the same seat. She got there early and sat in the seat, and every night she came early and sat in the same seat. I noticed her every night. And when we got to the end of the talk every night, I would make an offer and say, you know what, if you need God's forgiveness, and you're willing to say sorry for what you have done so you can be forgiven, so I'll just invite you to stand where you're sitting, and I would love to pray for you. And every night, you know, people stood up, 15, 20 people every night, and every night I thought she was going to stand up. It's almost like she started to stand up and then she would sit down. And on the last night, I can remember as I was thinking about the meeting and what I was going to say that night, I thought, you know, if that lady comes again, I'm going to go and talk to her. And sure enough, she came, sat in the same seat, came early, and after I'd finished talking, there was the same invitation. Would you like me to pray for you? If you do, just stand up where you are and I'll pray for you. It looked like she was going to sit up, and then she sort of sat down again. And so after I'd finished talking with everyone else, I came and sat next to her. And I said, do you mind if I talk to you for a few minutes? She said, not at all. I said, every night, maybe I've been mistaken, it looks like that you wanted to say yes to this offer of God's forgiveness for you. And then it's like you stopped yourself and sat back down in your chair. She said, that's true. She said, I've been trying to stand up on the inside. I said, can I ask you what you're wrestling with? She said, I was sexually abused by my grandfather. Between the ages of 5 and 13, he sexually abused me in all kinds of ways. And she said, and I've been coming here every night and I've been thinking, I need God to forgive me for what I've done wrong, but I'm worried that if he forgives me, I'll have to forgive my grandfather. And so I said to her, well, are you having some counselling at the moment? She said, I am. I said, what's your counsellor saying? And she said, well, my counsellor's telling me that I need to express my anger and express my rage and yell it out. And I said, well, is that working for you? She said, no, it's making things worse. And then I said, you know, it's interesting, Jesus Christ warned us about taking bitterness into our hearts. He said, if we take bitterness into our heart, we have a problem. I said, it seems to me you're paying twice for what's happened to you. You paid at the time your grandfather did this terrible thing to you, and every time you remember it, you're paying again. And she said, that's exactly what it feels like. I said, when you let go on the inside of that hurt and bitterness, your grandfather will still be held to account. He'll have to stand before God and explain why he did what he did. But when you let go of it on the inside, you stop paying every single time you remember it. And it was a huge joy for me to be able to pray with her that evening. For her to experience the forgiveness that she had never earned or deserved. And then to find a way to let go on the inside. That doesn't mean that her grandfather gets released from prison. It just means now that all that bitterness and anger that's now controlling her life. And this is classically what we've done with counselling. In terrible situations in counselling, if you can't... Some events in our lives are just so horrible, they scar us forever. We live with the scar for the rest of our life. But good counselling is designed to put you on a parallel track. It's designed... What you're trying to say to the victim is, look, don't let this define you. This terrible thing that happened to you, it shouldn't define you. It doesn't define who you are. You're more than that. And you're also saying to them, and it shouldn't determine your future. Don't allow this person to steal your future as well as whatever they did to you in the past. And even if they have to live with the memory of it and struggle with it, you want to put them on a parallel track and say this doesn't define who you are and it shouldn't shape your future. And there's an enormous freedom that comes from that. And that's what God is also extending to Jonah. The way the book ends is God says to Jonah, Jonah, shouldn't I be compassionate? Shouldn't I forgive them? There are so many people in that city. Shouldn't I care about them? As well as you? And the book ends there. It's almost like God's inviting the reader of Jonah to write their own ending to the story. Now, I'm an optimistic kind of guy. I like happy endings, I don't mind admitting it. Okay, I've read an awful lot of French existentialist novels because I've had to. Have anyone read any French existentialism? Anyone here? Camus, Sartre, any of those guys? Yeah, in the back. Have you ever read a happy one? Yeah, you see, that's the challenge, isn't it? So I like happy endings. But my preferred ending to this is Jonah looks at God and says, God, you know what? Yeah, I guess I don't come out of this looking pretty good myself. So will you please forgive me? There's a sadder ending to the story, the French ending, where God basically says, Jonah, I hate you and I want nothing to do with you. And Jonah never receives the peace and the forgiveness from God that God is offering. We're living in a world which is at danger of ripping itself apart. Our global politics is locked in this huge vortex of grievance where we're all trying to out-victimize each other. And we're so unwilling to forgive anybody for anything. God is passionately interested in justice. He really is. But the incredible thing is when you've encountered the love of God in the person of Christ, He brings about justice in a way you never expected. This church at the moment is doing a series on the Creed. And in the Creed, one of the statements is that Jesus came into this world and He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was died and crucified. Literally, Jesus was nailed to a cross for something that He didn't do and wasn't guilty of. And when He was on the cross, He prayed, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. That's amazing. while all of that hatred looked on, while he was being insulted, as people were yelling at him from the thing, when he was being killed for something he'd never done, his prayer was for forgiveness. These people who hate me, and the hatred that's driven them to this point, Father, I want to pray that they will be forgiven. May they know forgiveness. It changes everything. That kind of love changes everything. You know, there's a statue in London. It's one of the most photographed statues in the UK. All kinds of tourists go there. It's in Piccadilly Square. The same statue actually appears on the masthead of the London Evening Standard. So if you walk through London or ever lived in London, you've seen it every day, multiple times a day. And most people don't know what it is. Most people think it's a statue of Eros, because it's a fat, chubby fat cherub with little wings and a bow and arrow. And so people come and, you know, they'll sometimes get people to take a picture of them. One will stand at one side of the statue like they're firing the bow and arrow, and, you know, someone else stands on the other side of the statue, you know, like they're going to get shot with this arrow of love. And, you know, it's a tourist snap. Well, here's the irony. That is not the statue of Eros. That is the statue of Eros's lesser-known brother, Anteros. Now, Anteros is the opposite of Eros. Eros is a love that's a hunter and consumes other people. Which is why we have Antarctica. That makes sense? Because we discovered one polar cap and it had bears on it. And then we discovered another polar cap and it had no bears. Antarctica, no bears. That's how it translates. It's a place with no bears. So this is not Eros. It represents selfless love. The statue was erected in memory of a guy called Lord Shaftesbury. This very entitled, privileged man. And when he encountered the love of Christ and realized there'd be a day when he would be held to account, it totally changed his life. He changed labor laws, schools, nurseries. He's sometimes known as the person who invented the idea of modern childhood. He changed civic laws, legal laws. He so transformed the face of this country that when he died, the people of London wanted to erect a statue in his honour, but they knew he wouldn't want a statue of himself. That would be too narcissistic. So instead they erected a statue of Anteros to represent this selfless, self-giving love. And which is why the official name of that statue is the Angel of Christian Charity. It's meant to represent a life that has now so encountered this love and this grace from God that it totally changes you to the extent of changing the nation. The book of Jonah is read aloud in the state of Israel every year on what's called the Day of Atonement. It's read out to the nation every year. It's a day where people come before God and ask for forgiveness. Why would you read the book of Jonah out loud to your country every year, year in, year out, for thousands of years? And the answer is because actually this book is hopeful. This is not actually a tragic story. This story shows that even when Jonah, who's meant to be worshipping God, is so angry with God and says it is right and I want to be dead, Jonah responds with grace and love. God responds to Jonah with grace and love. No matter how much hatred is in Jonah's heart, God comes with his love and he says, Jonah, I'm offering you the same thing. You might be visiting here tonight, in which case I hope that some of what's been said makes at least some sense to you. And I'd love to be able to invite you. I'm not a member of this church myself, but they're running something called the Alpha Course here, and it's something that I myself have also run at times and know about. And I would love to invite you on it. It's a way to come and find out about the Christian faith. It's a way to discover whether it's actually true and real or not. And I would encourage you, if you're just visiting and you want to know what the Christian faith is actually all about, why don't you come along? You can come along and try it. It's a way just to see, what does the Christian faith actually achieve? The God who's actually talked about in here, what are they like? Well, why don't you come along and find out? And you'll be told about how to do that. It may be possible that you're listening to this and you're thinking, you know what, some of this stuff has overtaken my life. There are times where I feel so caught up with grievance and hatred and anger. And I'd just like to know this power of this forgiveness in my life, so it doesn't control me, it doesn't define me. I need to be set free in the way. Well, I'm going to offer a prayer at the end of this, which you can pray with me. But I'd also like to offer, if I can, a challenge to all of you here today who describe yourself as Christians. Because if that is who you are, we can't buy into this narrative of grievance and hatred. It's got no place in the Christian gospel. God is absolutely concerned with justice, but here's the amazing thing. The more you encounter his justice, his love, and the more you're forgiven, the greater the heart you will develop to help other people. It should bring about a generosity of spirit. It should bring about a generosity of spirit in the same way it did in Lord Shaftesbury, where you think, what I've got, I need to give. How can I get involved? How can I give my time? How can I give my money? How can I give my effort? How can I change this world around me? Having experienced so much favor and love and grace and compassion, how do I extend that to other people, even with people who may hate me? How do I reach out to those and actually show and manifest this love? That's part and parcel of what it means to be a Christian. You know, during the time of Lord Shaftesbury, very often when they preached in their churches, they used to say, don't ask the question, what can I do? Ask the question, what more can I do? And so let me ask you, if this is your church, what more can you do? What more can you give? What more can you say? What more can you get involved with? He's interested in you giving everything to him and for him and with him. And it will be the most incredible thing. At the beginning of this year, I was invited to speak in the part of the country my mother's from that's now under foreign occupation by a foreign army. And I'm standing on a piece of land that could well have belonged actually to my family in this beautiful 5-star deluxe hotel with a casino on it. And I'm now speaking to these people. And the question is, what do I say to them? Now, I wasn't expecting it to affect me as emotionally as I am, but as I crossed over the border into this military-controlled state, I'm now standing there looking at thousands of people, and what I want to basically say is, hi everybody, I've come for my land back. You know, the stuff that the army took away, and by the way, you know, 30,000 of our people just disappeared. I mean, they just disappeared. They were never heard from again. Not buried, not anything. They just disappeared. You know, so, you know, what am I going to say to them? How should I feel about them? Well, the answer is I should feel about them the same way God feels about them. Well, how does God feel about them? Well, he feels the same way about them, he feels about me. Well, how does he feel about me? Well, he came to me and he said, Michael, even though you've messed up, I love you. And I've paid a price so that you can be forgiven. So what am I going to say to them? And the answer is the same message. God's willing to forgive you too. He wants there to be a love and peace between us, and then let's figure out this together. But the hatred and the anger and the bitterness will get us nowhere. I'm wondering if I can invite you just to pray with me for a minute. We're running slightly over. I do apologise for that. That's because it's late and tired, and I only landed at Gatwick late last night. And here's what I'd just love to pray for you. If you're here in this place and you just know that you're in a position right now, you're caught up in whatever it is, and you need to know that love and forgiveness in your life, and you want to manifest it, I just want to love to pray a simple prayer that says, God, may I know that. And if you're praying that, get involved with Alpha. Talk with someone before you leave. Maybe you even want to pray with someone before you leave, just tonight, for them just to talk to you a little bit more and explain what's going on. But I'll just invite all of you just to pray with me just for 30 seconds if you would like to. And if you know this has to be particularly for you, this message is for you, why not just, as your eyes are closed, just open a hand as a sign of just saying, God, I need to receive this from you. Father, I want to thank you that you love us and you know us. Lord, we live in a world that seems to be so caught up right now. Lord, in accusation and counter-accusation, Lord, we long to see that cycle broken, and we pray that you would start with us. Lord, will you start with me? Or will you break that cycle in my heart? Lord, I thank you that from the cross you prayed that we may know forgiveness, and Lord, we come today before you asking for forgiveness. Lord, will you forgive the times when I've been judgmental, filled with anger, hatred? Lord, may I know that forgiveness from you. Lord, will you teach and show me why it is that you and you alone are able to break and change this? And Lord, will you give me a fresh heart and compassion for those around me? Lord, may I model something different. And Lord, we long to see this world, Father, coming together in different ways, Lord, to bring about a better place than the one we inherited. And Lord, we want to ask, Lord, that your will be done here on earth in our life as it is in heaven. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for blessing us and serving us.